What happens when a billionaire mocks a waitress in his own language, thinking she's too uneducated to understand? In front of his powerful friends, he laughs at her until she opens her mouth and responds fluently, exposing his arrogance for the whole world to see. Stay with me, because this story will leave you stunned. The restaurant was buzzing with wealthy businessmen, politicians, and celebrities. It was one of those high-class places where a glass of water could cost more than a normal family's dinner. The soft lighting reflected off crystal glasses and polished silverware, and the low hum of conversation filled the air like background music. Every detail of the room screamed luxury. Marble floors, velvet chairs, waiters in crisp white uniforms gliding smoothly between tables. This was a place where the powerful came not only to eat, but to show off their influence, their clothing, and their status. Among the guests sat a German billionaire named Hans Keller, known across Europe not only for his wealth but also for his arrogance. He was the kind of man who believed money gave him the right to say and do whatever he pleased. Rumors about his cold-hearted business deals and his cruel treatment of employees had followed him for years. Yet here he was, sitting with a group of equally wealthy friends, laughing loudly, dominating the room with his presence. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his gold watch glittering under the chandelier light, his every gesture calculated to remind people of who he was. That night, as the waitstaff moved quickly to serve tables, a young black waitress named Amara approached Hans's table with a polite smile. She carried herself with quiet dignity, balancing the heavy tray in her hands with practiced ease. Amara had worked in the restaurant long enough to know the kind of people she served. Some were polite and grateful, others dismissive and cold. But no matter who sat in front of her, she treated them with the same respect. She placed down Hans's order carefully, her movements smooth, her tone professional as she spoke in perfect English. "Here you are, sir. Enjoy your meal," she said softly, her voice steady despite the pressure of serving such high-profile clients. But instead of thanking her, Hans leaned back in his chair, smirked at his friends, and whispered something in German. The words slid out of his mouth like venom, coated with mockery. He didn't care that Amara was standing right there. In fact, he wanted her to hear the tone, if not the meaning. His eyes glinted with arrogance as he chuckled, nudging the man next to him as though they shared a private joke. The words were sharp and cruel. He mocked her accent, sneering that she was beneath him. He insulted her background, making crude remarks about her skin color and heritage. And worst of all, he laughed about how she was just a servant, someone whose entire life, in his eyes, was reduced to carrying plates and pouring drinks. He leaned forward, muttering that she probably couldn't understand a single word he was saying anyway, because someone like her could never be educated enough to learn his language. His friends burst into laughter, shaking their heads as if this kind of humiliation was normal entertainment. Amara stood still, her tray now empty, her hands resting at her sides. To them, she looked like an easy target, an anonymous waitress in a fancy restaurant, someone they could dismiss without consequence. They thought she was clueless, that she would simply walk away, too intimidated or too uneducated to realize what was happening. But they were wrong, very wrong. Amara stood there silently for a moment, her hands still holding the tray. The weight of the dishes had left a slight strain in her arms, but she didn't move. Instead, she lifted her chin with quiet confidence and locked eyes with Hans. For the first time that evening, the arrogant billionaire felt something he wasn't used to, being challenged. Her gaze was steady, unshaken, the kind of look that told him she was not intimidated by his money, his status, or his reputation. Then, with a calm but firm voice, she replied, in fluent German. Her words rolled off her tongue effortlessly, her pronunciation crisp, her tone sharp yet controlled. "Really?" she said, pausing just long enough to let the shock settle over the table. "Do you think I can't understand when you insult me? Do you believe that because I serve tables, I have no education or value?" The effect was immediate. The laughter that filled the table just seconds before died instantly. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Glasses of wine trembled in hands that had suddenly gone stiff. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter as people sensed something unusual unfolding. Hans's face drained of color, his smirk vanishing as the realization hit him like a punch in the chest. The woman he had just mocked understood every single word. His eyes darted nervously to his friends, but they were just as stunned, their mouths slightly open, their expressions filled with disbelief. Amara did not falter. Her voice was clear, resonant, each word striking with precision. She continued in flawless, elegant German. I studied your language for years. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And unlike you, I use my knowledge to lift people up, not tear them down. Her tone wasn't raised, but it carried the weight of truth, a kind of authority that money couldn't buy. She spoke with the calmness of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. The dining room had fallen into a hush. Guests at surrounding tables leaned slightly forward, pretending to mind their own business, but clearly listening. Eyes began to drift toward the billionaire's table, curiosity and anticipation sparking in the room. The waiters, who usually moved quietly like shadows, slowed their steps, drawn to the unfolding confrontation. Hans shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tugging at his collar, as if the air around him had suddenly become too heavy. For years, he had used his power to silence others, to ensure no one dared to stand up to him. But in that moment, with just a few sentences, Amara had stripped away the illusion of control he thought he owned. And the most unsettling part for Hans? She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't shown anger, hadn't even insulted him back. She had simply revealed her strength, and it was enough to shake the billionaire to his core. Hans tried to laugh it off, forcing a dry chuckle that echoed awkwardly in the silent room. It was just a joke, he muttered, switching back to English as if that could soften the sting of his words. But his voice cracked slightly, betraying the unease brewing inside him. His carefully crafted image of confidence and superiority was slipping, and everyone could see it. The billionaire who was used to commanding boardrooms and bending people to his will suddenly looked small, fragile, almost exposed. Amara didn't flinch. She leaned slightly closer, not in aggression, but with the calm authority of someone who knew the truth was on her side. Her voice was steady, controlled, and yet carried the kind of weight that made every word cut deeper than a shout ever could. You see, Mr. Keller, people often think money makes them powerful, she said, her eyes never leaving his. But true power is respect. And right now, everyone here can see how little you have. The words landed like thunder. Around the table, Hans's wealthy companions shifted uncomfortably. Some pretended to busy themselves with their glasses. Others stared down at their plates, desperate to escape the humiliation radiating from their once dominant friend. Not a single one of them moved to defend him. Murmurs began to ripple through the restaurant. Guests at nearby tables whispered, their voices carrying enough for Hans to hear fragments. Arrogant, disgraceful. She's right. A few diners, bold enough to show their approval, clapped softly, their applause sharp in the otherwise tense silence. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a clear message. The room stood with Amara. Others shook their heads in disgust, glaring openly at Hans as though his money and reputation could no longer shield him from the judgment of ordinary people. Every passing second stretched longer, each one pulling Hans deeper into the pit of shame he had dug for himself. His hands twitched nervously against the tablecloth, fingers fiddling with the edge of his napkin. He glanced at his friends, but their faces were turned away, embarrassed to be associated with him. Even they, the people who once laughed at his cruel jokes, wanted no part in his downfall. For the first time in years, Hans Keller, the man who believed no one could stand up to him, the man who thought his fortune placed him above basic decency, was the one shrinking in his chair. The mighty billionaire looked less like a powerful tycoon and more like a child caught misbehaving, stripped of his pride and left with nothing but silence pressing down on him. But Amara wasn't done. She took a small step back, gathering herself before she turned her attention from Hans to the wider crowd. Her voice shifted back into English, clear and steady, so that everyone in the dining room could understand every word. "I wasn't always a waitress," she began, her tone carrying both humility and strength. The words carried across the room like a wave, pulling everyone deeper into the moment. "I studied international relations at university. I've lived in 3 different countries and speak 5 languages fluently. I work here not because I lack skills, but because I value honest work. Every person, no matter their job, deserves dignity." The effect was immediate. Her statement hit the room like thunder rolling across the sky. People who had been whispering now sat upright, eyes locked on her, realizing they weren't just watching a confrontation. They were witnessing a lesson. Guests began nodding subtly, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. They weren't just impressed by her intelligence. They were moved by her courage to speak the truth in a room full of the wealthy and powerful. At a table not far away, an older gentleman with silver hair and a sharp suit rose to his feet. His cane tapped lightly against the floor as he stood tall, his eyes fixed proudly on Amara. "Bravo," he declared loudly, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Well said, young lady." His applause rang out first, crisp and deliberate. Then another diner joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was filled with the sound of clapping hands, a chorus of appreciation for the waitress who had just taught a billionaire a lesson he would never forget. Some guests even whistled softly. Others smiled warmly at Amara, as though silently thanking her for saying what so many had always wanted to say. Hans sat frozen, his face pale, his jaw tight. The man who had built an empire on commanding attention now found himself powerless in the face of one woman's dignity. His reputation, carefully crafted over years of influence and intimidation, was collapsing right in front of people who once admired him. No amount of money could buy back the respect he had just lost. He was trapped in silence, forced to sit there as the applause around him grew louder, each clap pounding against his pride like a hammer against glass. The restaurant's manager rushed over, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he weaved through the crowd of diners who were still buzzing with excitement. For a moment, it looked as though he might pull Amara aside and reprimand her for causing a scene. But instead, he stopped at her side, placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, and spoke with pride rather than anger. "You handled yourself with more grace than most could," he said warmly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. "This establishment is proud to have someone like you representing it." His words brought a new round of nods and murmurs of approval from the crowd. Meanwhile, Hans couldn't escape. Everywhere he turned, eyes followed him, some filled with judgment, others with outright disgust. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a man who suddenly seemed smaller, weaker, and deeply out of place. Whispers surrounded him like a storm cloud. Guests leaned into one another, exchanging comments that he couldn't quite make out, but he knew the meaning well enough. Even worse, several phones were discreetly raised, recording every second of his humiliation. Hans had spent years cultivating a pristine public image, but in less than 10 minutes, that image was shattered beyond repair. By the next morning, the internet had taken the story far beyond the walls of that restaurant. Clips of the incident were everywhere, replayed on news broadcasts, shared across social media, and discussed on talk shows. Headlines exploded in bold letters. "Billionaire exposed by Waitress. Humility wins over arrogance. Fluent clapback leaves tycoon speechless." The story touched people worldwide. Thousands commented on Amara's courage, praising her for standing up not only for herself, but for every person who had ever been belittled for their work, background, or appearance. She received messages of support from strangers in every corner of the globe, many thanking her for reminding them of the importance of dignity. Within days, job offers began pouring in from international firms impressed by her intelligence and composure. Universities extended invitations for her to speak to students, seeing her as a voice of strength and resilience. As for Hans Keller, the fallout was devastating. His business partners quietly began to distance themselves, concerned that his arrogance and public disgrace would drag their reputations down with him. Shareholders questioned his leadership, and meetings he once dominated were now filled with cold stares and silence. His name, once synonymous with wealth and influence, became a cautionary tale whispered in corporate circles. No amount of money can protect you when you treat others without respect. Amara eventually left the restaurant, not out of shame, but because her path had expanded far beyond its walls. She embraced the opportunities that came her way, stepping into a future filled with purpose and recognition. Yet despite her success, she remained humble, often telling her story not to boast, but to inspire. She would remind people gently, never underestimate anyone. The person you look down on today may be the one who exposes who you truly are tomorrow. Her words, just like that unforgettable night, echoed far beyond the restaurant, leaving a lesson the world would not soon forget. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another powerful video. Thanks for watching.